You know, my friends, the news these days is dominated by what's going on between Ukraine and Russia and the possibility of it expanding beyond them. And, rightfully so, I suppose that the news should be dominated by that. It's kind of a big deal, right? But it's often when the news is dominated by one thing that other things slip in. And one of the things that happened yesterday was that Biden signed a $1.5 trillion spending bill. Now, bills get signed to spend money all the time, but normally it's a little more top of mind than what we're seeing right now. And again, there's probably good reason for that. But what's happening is that we're continuing to add to our national debt. But debt is often confused amongst the population with the word deficit. And it's a language thing that's often used by politicians to try to make things look better than they are. But I'm finding with the people that I've been talking to that a lot of them don't necessarily understand the difference between debt and deficit. So the goal of this video is I want to explain in terms that everybody can understand what debt is, what deficit is, and then what role that would play in inflation, which is another big thing that we're experiencing right now. So that will determine how it all translates to you personally, okay? So we're going to just dig right into this. My name is Dan. This is the Soule of Wisdom. Thank you for joining me. Okay. Let's start with this. Again, I had just stated that Joe Biden signed a $1.5 trillion spending bill. But during his State of the Union, Joe made a statement. And he said by the end of this year, the deficit will be down to less than half of what it was before I took office. The only president ever to cut the deficit by more than $1 trillion in a single year. Okay? Now, that sounds really good, right? Well, he's cutting the deficit. He's cutting it by $1 trillion. And, oh, by the way, he's taking credit for something that hasn't happened yet. He says we'll cut it by the end of the year, but then he says the only president ever to cut the deficit by 1 trillion in a single year. Well, it hasn't been done yet, so he can't claim that, but he did. Regardless of that, he's very strategically using the word deficit there. Okay, so let's define what debt and deficit are. All right, and I'm going to do this in terms that would apply to everybody and be fairly simple. So let's say, and this is again a hypothetical because this isn't how real money works nowadays, but let's keep it simple. Let's say you need $20 to make your life work for a month, okay? And again, I know that's not realistic, but I don't have thousands lying in front of me, but I got a couple of 20s. So let's say you need $20 to make your life work. That includes your food, your rent, your utilities, a little bit of entertainment, whatever the case may be, right? So you need that $20. And you bring in $20 from your work. Okay, that's good. You're bringing in what you need to make your life work. That's solid. It would be nicer if you could bring in a little more so you could save and plan for the future, but you're covering your obligations, okay? But let's say you still need that $20, okay? But the next week you only bring in a couple of fives, so you only bring in $10, okay? Now what you have is what's called a deficit. You don't have enough money to cover your obligations. That's what a deficit is. Now there's a couple of ways that you can cover deficits. Let's say that you were good and that you were able to bring in more money from time to time and you put that money away for a rainy day. So at that week, or that month rather, where you needed $20, but you only had the 10, you went ahead and got into your savings to get the other 10 to cover stuff. So you've made it good. You've covered the month. You haven't had to do anything other than work with the money that you have. Okay? But let's say you've had to do that for a few weeks and then all of a sudden you've got nothing left. Okay? And you still need the $20 to cover your month. But again, you're only bringing in 10. So then what do? Well, now you have to go into debt to cover your deficit. Okay? Your deficit is what you're short. All right? You're short $10. So you're going to break out the credit card or you're going to run to mom and dad or Uncle Joe. Uncle Joe. Yeah, I didn't even pick that name on purpose, but or, heaven forbid, run to the local loan shark, and you're going to ask for $10, or you're going to borrow that $10 against your credit card. Now you're creating debt, okay, to cover your deficit. Again, deficit being what you're short. And the problem with that, obviously, is that debt at some point still has to be paid. But let's say things start to look up and you have a few months where you're bringing in a few more dollars than what you need. So you pay off the debt and eventually you get it right. But that doesn't happen for the majority of Americans, unfortunately. Once they start to have to run to the credit card, once they have to start to accumulate debt to cover their deficit. Again, deficit being what you're short. Okay? So what they'll do eventually is they'll run out of places to borrow from. And then what happens? Well, obviously at that point we're talking about bankruptcy. At that point, you're probably going to have to liquidate most of the things that you've accumulated, most of the things that you've owned. You're going to have to go into that debt bankruptcy hell for 6 or 7 years while you're waiting for it to clear off your credit report, and you're screwed. That's the bottom line. But you've had to borrow, you've had to create debt to cover your deficits because your obligations were more than what you were bringing in. Okay? That's real kind of simplistic view of this. But politicians use the words debt and deficit interchangeably, and they'll often use the one that makes them look better, and often that's the deficit word. But we don't necessarily realize the difference, okay? Again, deficit being how much you're short, okay? As long as there's a number attached to that deficit, it's a shortage. So when Biden says we're reducing the deficit by $1 trillion this year, which again, he still has to prove that he's going to do, that still implies, and in fact is true, that we still aren't covering our obligations, okay? The government still has to spend its $20, if you will, but again, the government's only bringing in 10, so he still has a shortage, still can't cover the government's obligations, which keep getting bigger and bigger, by the way, as we spend more and more on social programs and infrastructure and aid to Ukraine and all of this. We continue to increase our obligations. But here's the difference between the government and you. The government has the credit card, okay, just like we do. But the government's credit card essentially is the Federal Reserve. The ability to continue to print money. It's like an unlimited credit card, okay? So if we're running short, well, we'll just, dial up the money printer and we'll put more money out into the economy. You can't do that. There's going to be a cap at some point to the amount of debt that you're able to ramp up, all right? Now, in case you don't believe me that we continue to wrap up debt, if you've never looked at this, on the screen right now, this is the national debt clock. This is how much we're accumulating. And look up here where it says U.S. national debt to the left of your screen. And it's currently over $30 trillion. And do you see how fast this accumulates? We average about $100,000 in additional debt every 5 seconds. Think about that. And the debt, if we ever wanted to pay it off, currently would cost us about $91,000 per citizen. And then if you go down here where my cursor is currently looking, where it says U.S. federal debt to GDP ratio, okay? The GDP is the gross domestic product. This is basically the value of all of the goods and services we produce in the United States in a year. So how much are we worth? What's our worth monetarily, okay? And it used to be back in 1960 that our debt was about 53% of what we were worth. So we owed less than what we were worth. So our value was higher than our debt. And then in 1980, that distance got even greater. It got down to 34%. But now it's 125%. We owe more as a country than we're even worth. Wrap your brain around that, because that's where bankruptcy happens for the rest of us, right? When we owe more than we're worth, we're getting into a spiral that at some point we're going to have to go bankrupt. That is what the country would be looking at if it weren't for the fact, quite frankly, that we can continue to print money. Now, where's this a problem? This is where inflation comes in, okay? Inflation, the simple definition of it is too many dollars chasing too few goods. So the more and more money we put into the economy, the more and more money we have to print and put out in circulation to cover our deficit, to cover how much we are short. That money gets into the system, and so there's more and more of it out there. Because there's more and more of it out there, it allows businesses to demand more money for their goods and their services. So costs go up, prices go up. That creates inflation. So this undermines us. The government's spending, the government constantly running a deficit, which Joe and so many other politicians, quite frankly, Republicans and Democrats, always try to spin this into being some kind of a good thing. Well, we've lowered the deficit. Well, that's great, but you're still spending more than you're bringing in. You're still adding to the debt, which causes money to be printed, which puts more in circulation, which creates inflation. Okay? So who pays the price for inflation? Well, you and I do. Okay? Through increased costs for food and for energy and for housing and for childcare and for everything that we would want. Our dollars that we bring in don't go as far. And most certainly, our income doesn't increase fast enough to keep pace with inflation. It never has. It never does. At least unless you try to improve yourself through getting into a better and better career, a better and better path to earn more money at each job. But if you're stagnant in the job that you're at, it's not like you're getting, inflation right now is like 10%. It's not like you're getting a 10% pay increase this year. I highly doubt it. So what do you do, right? Well, the bottom line is you're screwed. And it is the government that screws us over in this case, because while they're lowering the deficit, the shortage of the amount of money they need to cover their obligations, they continue to increase their obligations. They're bringing in less than what they need, and because of that, they have to print more money, and we pay the price. So I wanted to do this video so you understand what you're hearing from the politicians, okay? It's very easy in your brain to conflate def and deficit, to merge them together into one thing. They're not. They're completely different things. So when somebody tells you they're lowering the deficit and implies that's a good thing, the only time it's a good thing is when the deficit becomes zero. When the government brings in enough money to cover its obligations. And the only way to do that is going to be to do it properly, without printing more money, is going to be to tax the bejesus out of you, or it's going to be to lower its obligations, to make cuts in the things that it does. And that's another video to debate at another time. But I want you to understand that debt and deficit are not the same. And if deficit is being lowered, unless it's being lowered to zero, ultimately it doesn't help you. So I do hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please let me know what you thought of it in the comments, or frankly, if you didn't find it helpful, let me know what you think in the comments. I'd love to have a discussion. Did you understand the difference between debt and deficit before you came into this video? I'm guessing you might not have, because that might have been why you clicked on it. Do me a favor, if you did find it helpful though, please do consider subscribing to this channel. I would appreciate it. Also hit the notification bell so you can get alerted to other videos, like this one right up here, where we talk about what a vacuum bomb is, another thing that a lot of people didn't know about. So if you're not sure what that is, because that's being used in the Ukraine, or allegedly used at least, give that a look so you can understand. But I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. Until the next time I see you, thank you for watching.